So hi, everyone. This is Conrad. I'm one of the co-chairs for the PyData Global Conference this year. We're super happy to welcome Tariq for this experts briefings talk. Tariq has been working as a data scientist for over 25 years. Tariq, thank you. Take it away.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone else for joining in. I'm really looking forward to having a discussion. So what I want to do today is just spend maybe 10 minutes giving an overview of a brief history of regulation around data and algorithms, and where that's headed in terms of regulation that's expected to land in the coming years. I want to just touch on some of the main concepts because they're useful for us to understand no matter where we are working in the world. But then after that brief kind of overview, I want to have a group discussion with a project which is taken from a real life project, but with the names removed and simplified a little bit. And what I want us to do is for us to have an active discussion around how we would do that project, what the risks are, how we would mitigate those. And the idea is that this isn't some kind of test or anything. It's where we can raise questions that really bother us or where we can learn from each other. So no question is too trivial, and it's a really nice forum for asking those things that you always wanted to, because we're amongst friends. So that's my aim to do that. Just a small, tiny correction. I haven't been a data scientist for 25 years. I've been involved in data and technology for 25 years. I do have a background, I guess, in machine learning, data mining, and I've worked in sectors which are fairly regulated. For example, a decade in central government developing services which people use. And some of those services, if you don't get them right, people are impacted. And that's why we care about designing services and how they are developed and governed, care about that, getting that right. So I'll try and share my screen. Great. Can everyone see just one page of slide? Yep. Yeah. Great. Okay. So as I said, I'll give you a quick overview of where we've been and where we're likely headed, and some of the main themes and concepts that are in that regulation. And I'll talk very quickly about some of the lessons I've learned in how organizations do data science projects, how they get them right, how they get them wrong. I won't dive into it too deeply because the discussion is the main point. So certainly in the UK and in Europe, we have the main regulation, which is the GDPR, and its primary focus is about protecting the security of data primarily. It talks about accuracy, it talks about transparency, it also talks about a right to understand how data is processed and used. But when this legislation was designed, there wasn't such a big industry around algorithmic use of data. The focus is very much on protecting it. So that's the history. Over the last few years, governments around the world, the US, countries in Europe, in the East, and certainly in the UK, have been consulting and developing frameworks for thinking about how to assess the quality of an algorithm which is driven by data, and where the algorithm is sophisticated or complicated, which makes understanding how it works non-trivial. And that has led to a lot of debate around ethics, around transparency, around legality, and this has been a very healthy debate. One of the nice things around this discussion and activity is the surprising level of agreement and consensus around the world, whether it's the US, whether it's Asia, whether it's Europe, and including the UK, which is nice because it means that when these discussions and consultations and emerging frameworks become regulation, they're likely to be aligned. There's likely to be not significant divergence in terms of kind of philosophy. And so that's a nice thing, and it means business and interoperability across borders will be a little bit easier. Certainly in Europe, they are a little bit ahead of where we are in the UK, and they've been working quite hard and have just recently published proposals for what's called the AI Act, and that's around regulating sophisticated algorithms, quotes AI, and that's likely to land towards the end of next year. As a precursor to that, they've published a couple of years ago, I think it was, the Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. It's a very short document, but it was very popular because it was very clear and it explained the rationale behind the objectives. And the rationale can be drawn back to human rights, essentially. And it was such a clear document, it became popular, and versions of it were taken by other industries. So if you look at some of the private sector organizations, their own internal guidance is based on that. So if you only look at one document, I'd look at that one, and it's 37 pages long, and it's very, very clear, and it sets you up in good stead. The AI Act itself has some controversial elements to it, which hopefully will be ironed out between now and when it lands next year. For example, prohibition on facial recognition in real time. So there's immediately then a question of what does real time mean and what does not real time mean. So there's some terminology and issues to be dealt with there. Just a bit of a timeline to give you an idea of how fast things are moving. GDPR, it was landed 2016. The popular guidelines for trustworthy AI landed in 2019. The proposed regulations for AI, the AI Act in Europe, 2021, expected to be live in 2022. Now, the concepts are, I think, really important to understand because those are the ones we can apply to our own projects. So the GDPR had 7, and none of them will surprise us. It talks about things that, like accountability, accuracy of the data, integrity and confidentiality, security, lawful purposes for having data, transparency around what data you hold, and letting people know what data you hold about them. And also broader themes like aiming for limitation of data that you collect, enough for the purpose that you need it for. So those are useful concepts, but as we said, GDPR was mostly aimed at protecting data, and it wasn't as concerned around how we use data. There are some of the examples of some of the frameworks that have been merged over the last few years. And as I've said, the EU ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, if you only look at one, that's the one to look at. And as I've said, the versions of that branches, if you talk about, if you like GitHub speak, are to be found in other sectors. Now, the ethics guidelines set out 7 pillars which are useful to act as prisms to look through at your own projects. And again, they're not surprising, but they are fairly complete. So it's a useful conceptual model to have. Accountability and governance. We'll talk about these later when we grapple with a real project. Technical robustness and safety. Now, I have to say, when I'm talking to Python developers, data scientists who are very technological in background and love working with data and writing code and building systems, their focus naturally is on technical robustness, on accuracy, on performance, on kind of measurable kind of bias and variation and so on. And that's totally understandable. But from a project's perspective, from an organization's perspective, you have to get other things right, like governance, like understanding the legal basis on which we have access to training data, whether we can use data collected for one purpose elsewhere. Concepts like human agency and oversight. So the EU derives its frameworks and it grounds them in human rights and protecting the quality of life of individuals. It has a political vision for that, and that's something that you can agree or disagree with. And it believes that particularly over decisions that affect you, are life-changing, we should have human agency. We should be able to reverse or appeal or go back against those decisions and say, look, I disagree with this. It needs to be looked at again. So it avoids the tyranny of automated decisions about you. Some decisions are so risky or have such high impact that they require quite close human sign-off So these are concepts that are embedded in that framework. Some of the techniques that I've developed in machine learning are quite energy intensive. So we have to think a little bit about, do we want to use this much energy? Do we want to burn through this many trees? Does it match the purpose that we are putting the algorithm to? Very quickly, I'll say the regulation, it's a regulation, not a directive. So it's a legal, is legally applicable in all 27 countries. They don't interpret it, they enact it. And it's very similar to the GDPR. It has fines, so it has teeth. And it's extraterritorial. What that means is it applies to EU citizens, even if the services they use are not based in the EU. And one of the effects that has, like the GDPR, is that it has the effect of spreading and harmonizing these high standards around the world. And that's seen by some of us as very positive. You can't ignore a market of 450 million or a sixth of the world economy. As I said earlier, the concept, the philosophy behind the EU's framework is human rights, and I said it's worth kind of reading the text on that because it's easy to read, and it explains why it arises at certain objectives and controls. So the proposed regulation defines 4 areas of risk. It's driven by risk. What it says is that our response to a project, an AI project or a data-driven project, is driven primarily by the impact of it going wrong. So the first step is to understand what is the risk. And it defines 4 categories at this stage. And it's just worth briefly having a rough idea of what they are. Unacceptable risk is prohibited. So things like using subliminal techniques to alter people's behavior without them knowing you're doing that, that's clearly unethical and is prohibited. Social scoring by governments, again, that is prohibited. And there are some exceptions around military and police law and order, with exceptions that are time bound. For example, if there's an ongoing incident or somebody's been kidnapped, you can use techniques which are normally not allowed. High risk on the top right is where most of our interesting work is: medical equipment, financial services, public services, self-driving cars, these kinds of services, because those are the things that, if you get them right, have a positive impact. If you get them wrong, you can hurt people. So a lot of our work will be in that top right space. But it's also interesting to understand what the other 2 remaining categories are, so we can put them aside and calibrate what we mean by high risk. So limited risk is where, there's not, if you're selling flowers and you recommend the wrong flower, it's not going to really hurt anyone too much. But transparency is still required. And minimal risk is things like video game AI or spam filters, where it really doesn't matter too much if it goes wrong. You might be annoyed that the game's got a glitch or it's not behaving as you'd expect. So what does the high risk entail? What's the response to a project that falls into that category? Again, you shouldn't be surprised. It's asking for risk assessments. It's asking that you understand the data sets that you use to train your algorithm. It says high quality, but really we need to think about what is sufficient quality. Is the data kept up to date? Does it match shift and drift in the source from where we're deriving that data? Does it match any drifts or changes in where we're applying it? Auditability, traceability, reproducibility. If you end up being caught and have to explain how you arrived at your algorithm, you need to be able to have an evidence trail for that. Lots of startups are very keen on producing things that work, but don't focus so much on keeping records, and not just records of meetings, but keeping data sets and parameters that you used along your journey in a form that you can say, right, this is evidential, this is what we did. I won't read the rest of it, but you can later. Just say a few words, just a few lessons that I've learned in working with organizations around things that sometimes go wrong when they implement a project. The first thing I think to say is that they should really start with understanding what the responsibilities are first, and then assigning them to people. And that can mean people that they already exist or people have to bring in. What I often see is someone has to do the user research, someone has to check the bias, somebody else has to make sure the records are kept up to date, and you miss responsibilities by doing it that way around. So I see this happening a lot, which is why I've highlighted it. The other main point that I've seen go wrong sometimes is the top of the organization needs to understand that its investment in a project has to be proportionate to the risk. So often the organization, whether it's a startup or a large enterprise, gets very excited about the possibility of interesting algorithms and machine learning and AI and using data, and imagines all kinds of wonderful insights and outcomes. But it doesn't think enough about, well, what if it goes wrong? And that is what drives the business case for the investment in these activities, to get the safety right, to make sure that you invest in testing, that you invest in the research around the data, that you invest in feedback loops, which help you catch when things have started to drift or to go wrong. So that's a really important thing that I see go wrong. They find they can't afford to do the right things because they haven't invested, and the case wasn't made based on actual impact. So it's like security. You start with a description of how bad can it get, and that drives the investment. Don't start with a data scientist. Sorry to say that at this conference. As much as we love, start with accountability, an owner who understands it's their responsibility and their accountability if things go wrong. If you don't get that right, then you can't make the right decisions, or sometimes the decisions are resisted. So you have to get that clarity. Somebody has to say, this is the person that owns the risk. Once you've done that, again, no data scientist just yet, do the user research, understand what problem that it is that you're trying to solve. Because sometimes we are driven by our enthusiasm for technology and algorithms and some of the cool libraries. And we want to build something that's cool, but it doesn't necessarily match what would work for the users. So as cool as it is, if it doesn't work for users, we're losing value, or we're wasting resources. And then we develop and iterate with close feedback loops from testing. This is something I think most people in this conference are familiar with. And the other thing I keep seeing going wrong is the lack of a feedback loop, not just from testing, but from your users. There's no point in developing something which can't learn. It's not just your algorithm that's learning, it's your team, your project, your service has to learn when it's going wrong. So if your organization is not open and receptive to citizens, users, customers telling you that something's not right, then it's not going to learn. And so you need that sensor out there, and it needs to be responsive, and that process needs to be painless. It can't be a defensive bureaucratic wall that's put up. That's really important. And some of the things that do go wrong happen as a result of that. I'll stop talking there. That was just to kind of see the discussion a little bit. What I'll do before I go back to the kind of discussion room is to kind of paint a picture of a project which is based on a real world project. In fact, there's probably many of these. And what I'll do is I'll describe its mission, but I won't give too many details because I want our discussion to fill in some of the gaps, or to say, well, where's this and what about this? I think that active discussion is where we learn most and where we kind of have a meaningful discussion. So very briefly, our project is to provide banks with a better risk assessment credit score for people who are perhaps vulnerable, perhaps they're homeless. So that's a vague statement deliberately. So that's the mission. And this is your project, whether you're a startup or a team within a large organization. And we're going to talk about, well, how do we go about doing this? What are the risks? How do we control risks? What does ethics mean? And any other questions you want to raise. So I'll go back to stop sharing that. I hope that was a useful, thought-provoking introduction just to get the discussion going. So So let me ask the question to the group, actually. So this is a guided discussion, so I'll ask questions. So if we are developing a system to provide banks with a score around credit risk, we have to use some information to feed that. Where can we get that information from if the users are, as we've designed here, homeless? What information can we use? And then we can talk about whether that's feasibly obtainable, whether it's ethical, and so on. What information can we use? Any thoughts or ideas? Remember, some of these people will not have bank accounts, perhaps. Some of them won't have credit cards, so there's no credit history. And any thoughts around that? I think somebody's raised their hand. Do you want to
Yeah,
make a
I guess
suggestion?
like when you say homelessness, do you can you specify what you mean by that? Could like do you think mean something like digital nomad where they necessarily don't have a permanent residence? Or are you talking about homelessness in the sense of like being destitute and being forced to live on a street against your will?
So that's a really good question. And the reason that's a good question is because what you've identified is two different sets of circumstances which can lead to somebody not having a residence or an address in the traditional sense. So you can have individuals who are nomadic, perhaps, and therefore, and perhaps have great jobs and income and so on. They just happen not to reside anywhere for more than, say, 6 months. But there's nothing intrinsically risky around offering them financial products. So that's a great insight into understanding, well, let's understand why people might not have a data point such as an address longer than 6 months. And then there's a second category, which you said, where people are involuntarily without a home, so they perhaps having to sleep in shelters or on the street. So already you've asked good questions around, let's understand our users. If we say that the banks traditionally use a home address as an indicator of stability, we've identified a scenario where actually these users, these individuals, could be good customers, but there are valid reasons why they don't. So this theme around researching your users' lifestyles, understanding their circumstances is really important, and those assumptions around why people might not have, say, for example, a long-term home address can be kind of broken down into several valid reasons. So that's a great point there. Is it Manojit? Is that how I pronounce that right?
Manojit.
Manojit, fantastic. Yep. So that's a great question. Another question is, should banks be using a long-term residence address as a key indicator? Because they do at the moment. Many banks do. So we could say, as a project, actually, that has nothing to do with an individual's risk around credit products. There are other better metrics. So that's a valid question to ask around as well. So all these questions around challenging assumptions should be done at the early research stage. And the more of these kinds of questions we can have, the more likely to be find a solution that advances beyond what the traditional financial institutions are doing. I think there's a question from Ali, I think.
Yeah, I just want to chip in a little bit. I mean, this is a very challenging task, trying to come up with a credit score for homeless people. You need data to be able to do that. And to your point about using a long-term residence address, yeah, maybe banks shouldn't do that, but they will need to be able to contact these people. So some address will be necessary. To that point, and for initial data collection, maybe a collaboration with shelters might be useful, to be able to collect some data around this topic.
Yep. Excellent points. And you're absolutely right to say banks will need some data, and you're right to challenge the need for the particular data point around residence address, some way of contacting users. So if we've done our research right, we might find that people, even if they don't have a home address, they would likely have a phone or an email address or an SMS way of getting a phone number to get to them. And certainly in the UK, some of the charities will provide people with a telephone so they can access basic services. So already that realizing that gives us an advantage, a point on which to progress beyond the traditional method. So if we are going to focus on, say, a subset of users, so not the ones who are nomads, but people who happen to be homeless at the moment, don't have significant income, or maybe they do. They're homeless, but they might have some income because they work perhaps as well as need to use a shelter. So that's one category. What kind of information do you think we can use to convince a bank that this individual is safe to give a credit card to? What kind of information do you think is useful that somebody in those circumstances will have that data? So one example is the individual will be needing to purchase things, buy food, clothes. Even if that money isn't necessarily theirs, they might earn it, or they might be given some support. So there is a spending history, which isn't necessarily credit history in terms of taking a loan and paying it back. It's actual debit history. So they're buying things. Perhaps that can be used as an indicator of risk. So if somebody's buying food, but not buying, and I apologize for this example, if somebody's not spending the support money they get on, say, champagne or stereos or cars, is there something in there that we can use? I'll leave that out for a discussion there. Are there is there a concept of valid good spend versus valid bad spend? What do people think?
I think you definitely there. I think there's a lot of assumptions there, and possibly, I'm going to propose that maybe like you can just let the data speak and see if buying a lot of like basic necessities make people a better creditor versus if you're buying a stereo, and we can just sort of based on past experiences try to decide that.
Okay, so that's a really interesting, rich avenue to go down. So the idea there, I'm being deliberately controversial, by the way. So if we say, yes, if somebody's having to buy food and buying food, but is avoiding buying, say, champagne or things like that, does that make them a better customer? So there's questions around stereotyping. There's questions around judgment on how people live their lives. There's questions around, well, maybe they bought a birthday present for somebody, which was champagne. Maybe somebody's spending more than they have, but it could be that they have a child that they need to feed no matter what, because there is no option not to feed the child. So what does this tell us? It tells us two things. One, that actually the circumstances of this user group are rich and varied, and there are lots and lots of different scenarios which need to be considered. It's a much bigger problem than simply saying, let's set up a data science team, feed them the bank account details, and get them to correlate long-term debt or judgments against them with, I don't know, codes that enumerate the things they buy. We could do that and we can end up with a model that works, but what we've missed is insights into what valid reasons why people might be spending. So it's really complicated. So this is definitely a can of worms that we've opened. The second point, Conrad, that you've highlighted, which I was hoping that we would get into and which we have through your question, is this idea of judgment this idea of who decides what is okay for somebody to spend money on. Who says it's okay for somebody to have this kind of lifestyle? And the important point I want to make there is those are really difficult questions, and often there is no objective mathematical scientific answer. The answer lies in, and this is a difficult conclusion for many people, the answer lies in your own values. So if you're an organization, a startup, a developer, your values will be infused into the code that you write, the algorithms that you develop, the research that you decide not to do or to do. Now, that's something we can't get away from. So how do we deal with that? And we're all learning to do this. As an industry, this is new. But what has worked for me and the people that I've kind of helped work with is asking them, encouraging them to say, can you stand up in public and explain why you've made those value judgments? If you can defend that to the public in which you operate, then you're probably on the right track. You might get some controversy, but if you can't do that, you're doing something wrong. I'll stop talking there because I think some questions have come in. I think, Ali, you had a question, and there's a question in the chat. So, Ali, you raised your hand just earlier.
Yeah, not a question actually, but some idea about the initial data collection. Yes, some people may not have bank accounts, but bank accounts are not necessarily the only way to collect payment and, you know, make payments to wherever. For example, applications like Venmo in US allows you to make payments and collect payments with your cell phone. And to your point, you said homeless people may have some cell phones, even if they don't have an address. So that might be a way to collect some data.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your earlier point around using shelters to gain some insight and to connect with vulnerable individuals is a really important one, because we have to look after the welfare of our users. If they're taking part in testing, if we're doing research, they will know better than the technology team that we have working in our own organization. So again, so it's interesting, isn't it? There's a maxim, there's a kind of a slogan or a meme that says 80% of data science is cleaning data, and we all laugh and chuckle at that. Well, actually, at a project level, you know, I'm saying that actually maybe 80% or 60% of our work is in understanding users and their lifestyles and their circumstances in which they live, and understanding that, particularly when the products that we are designing can be life affecting if we get them wrong. So that there's an interesting parallel there. Let's move this discussion forward a little bit. So I don't want to underemphasize the importance of user research and understanding of users. It's huge, and we should proportionately give it a lot of attention. But let's, for the sake of this exercise, move forward to say, let's say we have some data now around people spending, because that's all they have really. It's they go into the supermarkets and they buy things, and they don't have a credit card, they buy it on debit. And we've gained agreement, for example, that we can have access to their bank accounts, so we can have a feed of spending data. Now, one of the questions that pops up in organizations is, we can have very simple models, you know, regression, something like this, for deciding whether somebody's a risk or not, or it's kind of decision tree. Or we can have something very much more complicated, like a very deep neural network, which is fed lots of features and data as inputs, and it produces an output. And it seems to produce something that is quite performant against the test data that we're using, but we can't explain it, or not easily. So this question of the black box. So some people will say, you should not, and some people who are working in policy and government space will say we should not use black box algorithms for automating decisions that affect people's livelihoods. Now, that's an open question. Different people will have a different stance on that. Different governments will have a different stance on that. What are the thoughts around the table? So I'll set the question again. we have a black box algorithm, like a very deep neural network. We're feeding it lots of information that we haven't really thought about. We're just throwing it all at it. And it seems to perform better than the decision tree that we can derive. Now, do we use it or not? There's lots of missing information there, but I want to just encourage some debate there. What are people's thoughts around that? Okay. So I'm not going to say there's a right or wrong answer here, but what I will say is we have black box systems in other sectors. So if we look at medicine, for example, the effect of a medication is not 100% deterministic. And the individuals into which that medication goes is varied, and people have different physiologies and react differently to medication. So we can't always say why there are side effects in some people and why medicine doesn't work or has a catastrophic effect. So the approach that has been refined over hundreds of years, not tens of years or even months, but hundreds of years, is this concept of broad testing, really having a systematic approach to and defining what kinds of individuals you test medication on, understanding what amount of testing is sufficient to achieve a level of confidence, having independent assessment of that testing process so that we are able to approve medicines where we can't always explain why they do or don't work in some individuals and might have a catastrophic effect. But we can say with statistical significance that, say, 98% of the time there's no negative effect, 70% of the time it works, and in 2% it has a very negative effect. So we do that in other sectors. We should be able to apply that thinking in terms of the application of so-called black box algorithms. So we can say empirically that it performs to a certain level. We can say statistically that it works, in 98% of cases tested on 20,000 people. So the question translates into not yes or no, but a question of when and how can we achieve assurance, satisfaction that it's safe enough. And that will depend on different contexts. So what I'm doing is encouraging you to move away from yes, no to, can this be made to work? Can we achieve satisfaction? Was there a question there? Did somebody raise their hand? I thought somebody did.
I just have a random thought on this. I think the government and certain sectors, I think it makes a lot more sense for them to not have a black box and have sort of more of a decision tree or some sort of factor-based model, simply because it allows people to adjust, right? So it allows somebody to appeal the decision and say, hey, you know what, I was disqualified for this reason. Here's my current situation. Maybe just using Manal's example, right? I was spending a lot on this, which disqualified me, but here's my medical reason for it, right? And it allows like a manual override, right? Which I think is valuable in certain cases where like you do need to take into account the ethical considerations are a lot higher, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And in some sectors or in some scenarios, we might value that. So that might be a legal requirement. So some sectors, there is a legal requirement for explainability and recourse. In others, there isn't necessarily there, but we might decide that we value an explainable model and an adjustable model over something that appears to perform a few percent better, but we don't know why it performs at that level. So again, that's a really valuable discussion. And in the more mature organizations that I've helped, that's where the discussion ends up. They have that discussion to say, we as an organization value the ability to explain and to kind of correct or adjust over just the output. But in other sectors, where the ability to kind of retrace those steps, if you've got a game engine you might not care. It doesn't really matter. So again, it depends on sector. That's a really, really good point. Sometimes we don't have a choice. So I think in the UK, in the finance sector, you have to be able to explain those decisions, which is quite a strong requirement. The Financial Conduct Authority runs a scheme where they have a regulatory sandbox, and they encourage companies to try different ideas which apparently go against current policy, but they're open to exploring the benefits of things like black box algorithms. If the benefit is significantly there, it's an opportunity for them to think about, well, how do we adjust regulations to kind of enable that, because we want to benefit from some of the advanced techniques that we have been developing. Are there any questions that anyone wants to ask that we haven't discussed, or where the discussion has gone one way, but you would like to kind of ask a question that's in a different direction? Is there any question that people want to, or any kind of direction that people want to go in this discussion?
So I have a random thought.
Sure.
So there is, so going back to sort of the explainable stuff with factors versus black box stuff. So for explainable stuff, if you know what all the factors are, there is the possibility to game the system, right? To just sort of like, have everything fit exactly there, right? But also, I don't think this has happened as much yet, just because I don't think like the model's so widespread yet. But for even for a black box thing, you can have some sort of like adversarial adversary example, right? In which case, it's probably going to be even harder to detect if you're gaming the system or not, right? Because in that case, it's probably not even going to show up as a abnormality, right? So I'm just curious.
Really interesting. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So as the sophistication of some of these models increases, the ability to detect fraudulent inputs or inputs that try to game the system, it gets quite hard. I think the way to think about it, certainly in my opinion, and there are different opinions are valid, is people sometimes can get into a moral panic about some of these failure modes, and there are lots of failure modes. And let me take a step back and say, one of the things that when discussing issues like this, one of the things that's really helped me is learning from parallel disciplines like information security. So if we say in information security, there's some really obscure vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And some people get very excited and enthused by that. The approach in that more mature field that has developed around dealing with those things is to say, what is at stake? What is the impact of that being exploited? So what's the impact of an adversarial example? What's the scale of it? So if one person out of 20 million manages to get a mortgage that they shouldn't have got, and they spend 2 months trying to work out what the right weights and inputs are, do we want to counter that? Is it worth the effort to counter that? Are we going to spend 5 million on development and testing for somebody who spent £150,000 on a home that they shouldn't have? So there's an issue of balance there. So I think taking that kind of risk-based approach to say, well, what is the impact? Do we care about this risk? Is it worth the investment to mitigate against it? Is the right approach? And again, these are questions for the team and the project and the organization, not just necessarily a technical developer, but the technical developers are valuable because they have the insights into the specifics of these kind of vulnerabilities. It's a growing field. It's really interesting. The vulnerabilities of sophisticated AI models. I think that I predict that will become a discipline and a job spec in itself. People who can kind of poke them and do the equivalent of pen testing or red teaming on these things. Really fascinating point. Okay, let's move on to a kind of a final theme. So there's a big debate around whether regulation will be a counter to innovation. It will slow down innovation. It stops companies experimenting and building useful services. And the UK at the moment seems to be heading in the trajectory of less regulation and being more pro-business, whereas other countries, perhaps like the EU, are heading in the more kind of cautious approach. What do people think here? I guess most people do work in this day to day. What are people's thoughts on where the right regulation should be? There's a question in the chat which says, any thoughts on how to be more systematic when it comes to the responsible use of AI? Yeah, so I think the broad picture is that this is a new field and good practice and patterns for doing this are emerging. So the reason when you speak to people who do this, they don't have a reference book or a clear-cut answer, is because we need to work a few more years for good practice to emerge and for the regulation to land, because that will shape how we work. It will define roles, for example. The best answer I can give you at the moment is to mirror what we do in information security, where we start with a risk assessment. We map out what data, what systems, which users, and we kind of estimate the risks, and then we try to control them. We should parallel and mirror the concept of having a senior risk owner, so that somebody really feels the incentive, the pressure, the responsibility to make sure these questions are addressed and raised and invested in. Too often we ask these questions, but there's no investment. There's no investment because the organization doesn't understand that this is a risk to the business. So I think if you're starting from nowhere, or if you're at the start of that kind of journey, there are good practices from information security. I think where we'd expand on information security is what we talked about at the start of this debate, which is more focus on understanding the user's context, their life, the reasons they might behave in certain ways. That is a lot more pronounced, those factors, than some of the information security challenges that we might face. So I would respond to your question in that way. Great. So I'm conscious of time, that we're coming up to an hour. Any last questions or thoughts? Or yeah, there's a question there. Is it Reshama? Is that right?
Yes, it's Reshma.
Reshma, hiya.
Building on what you said earlier, I come from a background of working on clinical trials, and so
Yep.
it is very, very highly regulated. That is something that could be brought into AI and data in general. There seems to be enough documentation out there about the times when AI is failing, all the algorithms are failing and the problems that they're causing, but there seems to be no recourse on how to do it. We just see it being, reported in the news. Maybe there's some lawsuits here and there, but regulation just like that would help.
Thank you. That's a really useful insight from the medical sector. You're absolutely right. We do too often hear about failures where there hasn't been the ability to have recourse. I'm not as aware as what's happening in the US, but certainly in Germany, there's a lot of work going on around how to use AI's type algorithms in medical scenarios. And again, it's very regulated, but they've done a lot of work in standardizing some of the kind of measures and the kind of assessments you would do. The big challenge that the medical sector faces, or certainly medical equipment, is that a lot of medical equipment and medical systems are designed and tested in a static context. They will work in this context, and then they're not adapted or changed. They're not expected to change. Whereas with machine learning and AI systems, often the characteristics of input data will change. The the scenarios in which they're applied will be varied. So the challenge to that sector has been, how do we certify something which is likely to be updated next month, next year, and the years after that? And that adaptability for some sectors is easy, but from my experience, the kind of the medical sector has found that adaptive updating of certifications quite difficult. It also actually happens to be the case in defense as well, where some of those systems are very highly assured, but the assurance context is static. And if you're developing systems that are adaptive and learn, that's where their value is. The ability to update a certification is a cultural challenge, not a technical challenge, but a cultural challenge. Reshma, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, just one more thing that we often hear, and I think, is that always keeping a human in the loop is, not having 100% of the decisions allocated to an algorithm, that having a human in the loop somewhere along the process would help.
Yeah, very, very good point. And certainly, from the EU's regulatory approach, that's really important and emphasized. My response to that would be, again, it depends on the impact. So you start from your picture of risk, and it may, because people are expensive, so it may be that for some scenarios you don't need to do that. For some of the lower impact scenarios, for some higher impact scenarios, you do need to do that, and the investment makes sense. But what's interesting is what sits in between. And I've been helping a few clients at the moment find that balance where it's not one or the other extreme, it's in the middle, where you benefit from the velocity and scale of an algorithm for 80% or 90% of your use cases, the data that's coming in. But what you do is you design an algorithmic ability to flag up riskier inputs for human approval. So you have a bifurcation. So for 80–90% of your workflow, you're still benefiting from the scale, performance, the cost effectiveness of an algorithm. But as soon as something unusual is detected, or emotional language is detected in, say, an application or something, then it's escalated. So what you do there is you have this interesting approach of a hybrid. And I think that works really well as well, because you're able to have a good story to explain to your public, your users, and your regulators to say, we're using technology because it's efficient, but we can catch a good number of risky cases and escalate them to humans. So I think that's worth thinking about as well. Fantastic. I think that's come up to the hour. Well, I thought the discussion was really, really interesting. And thanks to everyone who's raised questions. We can have this discussion for longer. And I think it does work better when we're all around the table with pens and paper. So maybe one day in future we'll be able to do that. But I'd like to thank everyone for taking part in what I think is an important area, making sure that the systems that we develop and design are safe, fair, and ethical. So thank you for joining in.
Yep. Thank you, Tariq. Thank you, everyone. And again, please, thank our speaker by tweeting to him. Details are in the chat.
Fantastic. Well, have a great conference. It looks like a really great schedule. Thanks very much.